Every time a movie or a TV show promises to give us a ruthless, brilliant villain, it almost always chickens out in the final act. We watch these characters outsmart the system for dozens of hours, operating with chilling, calculated precision. But right as the credits are about to roll, the writers inevitably panic. Suddenly, the mastermind who hasn't broken a sweat in years gets hit with a narrative penalty. They start panically laughing at rain clouds, slipping up on basic details, or facing some massive tragedy that strips away everything they built. It's the ultimate storytelling safety net, the illusion of cosmic karma. Even when fiction tries to be bold enough to let the bad guy win, it rarely lets them win cleanly. If the writers don't force a sudden mental breakdown, they insert a historical note at the end, like the appendix in 1984, or a bleak epilogue whispering to the audience, "Don't worry, they suffered in the end anyway." We are conditioned to expect things to balance out, but by forcing every competent villain to either lose their mind or pay a devastating tax on their legacy, modern storytelling has created a predictable, deeply unsatisfying pattern. We don't need fewer villain victories. We need stories brave enough to show villains who win without completely unraveling. And the fact that this is so incredibly rare reveals how safe modern narratives usually play it. A mandatory ceiling plays on how successful they're allowed to be. We get to watch these characters operate with flawless logic for 90% of the story, pulling off complex schemes that leave the heroes looking clueless. But the moment the story needs to wrap up, the writers pull the emergency brake. They systematically sabotage their own villains, either through a sudden final act meltdown, a crushing tragedy, or some built-in emotional flaw, just to make sure the audience goes home with a neat moral lesson. Take Death Note's Light Yagami. He spends years outsmarting global task forces, playing a high-stakes psychological game of chess like a literal god. He's calculated, meticulous, and completely clear-headed. Yet in his final moments, the show demands a pathetic, ugly breakdown. He's reduced to a sniveling, bleeding mess on a dirty warehouse floor, screaming like a terrified child as his illusion of control completely shatters. We see this exact same degradation applied to Eren Yeager and Attack on Titan. He initiates the Rumbling, a horrific world-ending event born of absolute terrifying resolve, only for his final hours to regress into a weeping pathetic confession on a beach about how he's just an idiot who stumbled into power, and doesn't want his crush to move on to another guy. Even Walter White, who actually keeps his tactical brilliance right up until his final breath, is forced to pay a massive situational tax. The writers don't let him ride off into the sunset to enjoy his millions. Instead, the narrative completely strips away his legacy. He loses his family, is forced to hide out in the freezing cabin in the middle of nowhere, and ultimately bleeds out alone on the floor of a meth lab. It's a masterful ending, but it's still structured as a cautionary tale designed to prove that a criminal mastermind will always lose what matters most. And then there's Homelander in The Boys, who represents a different kind of safety net, a preemptive one. He has the literal power of a god and could conquer the planet tomorrow if he wanted to, but the writers deliberately anchor him by giving him the psyche of a needy, insecure toddler. His desperate craving for public approval keeps him perpetually locked in an unhinged, manic spiral, ensuring he can never function as a stable, calculating mastermind who wins the game cleanly. Fiction treats these mental collapses and tragic downfalls not as natural character flaws, but as structural necessities. The message across all these massive stories is always the same. To be evil is to be fundamentally unsustainable. The narrative demands that these characters fall apart because audiences demand a comforting lie. The illusion that the lack of morality naturally makes you unstable. We are conditioned to believe that the bad guy will eventually beat himself, saving the writers from having to construct a world where a cold calculating monster simply outsmarts the heroes, gets the win and walks away completely fine. But then you look at the Penguin and you realize it is one of the few modern mainstream projects to completely reject this safety net. It delivers an ending that feels genuinely dangerous because the villain never loses his head. Oz Cobb doesn't get the Walter White treatment. He doesn't get a tragic introspective moment where his mind breaks under the weight of his sins, nor is he granted a sympathetic, bittersweet exit. Instead, the series finale gives us a chillingly pure example of a villain winning precisely because he remains entirely lucid, pragmatic, and emotionally detached when it matters most. Think about how easy it would have been for the writers to give Oz the classic pop culture meltdown. By the final act, his operations are compromised, his back is against the wall, and his rivals are closing in. The exact setup where a lesser show would have the villain snap, start screaming, and make a fatal ego-driven mistake. Instead, Oz adapts like a seasoned predator. He outmaneuvers Sophia Falcone, manipulates the corrupt system of Gotham, and systematically cuts down every single obstacle between him and the throne. The true test of his sanity at the moment the show firmly commits to letting a sane villain win comes in that quiet, devastating scene with Victor. He is his loyal prodigy, the kid who saved his life, and the closest thing to real family Oz has left. In almost any other television formula, this bond would be the villain's undoing. It would either manifest as a moment of mercy that backfires, or a source of crushing guilt that triggers a breakdown. But Oz looks at Victor, realizes that having someone to care about is a massive liability in his line of work, and calmly strangles him to death. This isn't a manic crime of passion or a psychotic break. It is a sober, calculated business decision. He deletes his own vulnerability to ensure his long-term survival. When the curtain drops, Oz isn't bleeding out in a dirty warehouse, or weeping over his choices. He's standing in a luxury penthouse wearing a tailored tuxedo, looking out over the city he now completely controls. Even the vegetative state of his mother isn't framed as a cosmic punishment that drives him mad. He simply folds her tragedy into his new reality, hiring an associate to roleplay his mother's pride, so he can continue to enjoy his success, completely unbothered. When the bat signal lights up in the sky in the final shot, it isn't a sign that Oz is about to face immediate justice. It's an ominous confirmation that he has successfully transformed himself into the undisputed apex predator of Gotham. He won the game, he kept his mind perfectly intact, and he forced the audience to sit with a deeply unsettling realization. Absolute ruthlessness, when paired with absolute sanity, is virtually unstoppable. By refusing to pull its punches, the Penguin joins an incredibly exclusive club of storytelling that has the genuine artistic courage to let a clear-headed villain walk away with a total victory. And this rule holds true whether that villain is driving the plot as the main character, or acting as the unstoppable wall that the heroes completely crash into. When you look at the rare stories that actually commit to this path, you realize they are the ones that stick with us the longest, precisely because they deny us the cheap closure we crave. Take Canton Sugar in No Country for Old Men. He isn't a theatrical, laughing comic book villain. He is a cold, mathematical force operating on his own unyielding logic. He hands down his targets, gets the money, and fulfills his horrific promises without a single drop of emotional instability or psychological decay. Even when the universe throws a random bone-shattering car accident at him in his final scene, he doesn't panic. He calmly ties up his broken arm with a shirt bought from a local kid. There is no cosmic karma waiting for him at the end of the road, no mental collapse, just a terrifyingly effective man continuing to exist, in a world that has no way to stop him. We see the same unsettling, realistic dread masterfully executed in David Fincher's Zodiac. The movie spends nearly 3 hours watching obsessed investigators destroy their personal lives, their marriages, and their sanity, trying to catch a ghost. And at the end, they don't catch him. The killer doesn't make a sloppy, ego-driven mistake to reveal himself. He doesn't have a theatrical monologue where he slips up. Instead, the movie just winds down and ends with a chilling reality check. The killer outran the clock, the system failed, and the credits roll without a single drop of traditional closure. It forces the audience to sit with the absolute discomfort of an unsolved, unfair reality where the bad guy got away with it cleanly, completely unpunished by the universe. This is the incredible power of pure novelty in storytelling, and it's exactly why we need it more often. When a narrative stops treating evil as a mental sickness or a temporary glitch in the system that will automatically fix itself, it forces us to confront a far more terrifying truth about our own world. Competence doesn't care about morality. In real life, the most destructive forces aren't many, unstable caricatures waiting to sabotage themselves. They are the calm, highly organized, and exceptionally disciplined individuals who know exactly how to navigate the rules to get what they want. By letting these villains win cleanly, without the artificial safety net of a sudden breakdown, fiction ceases to be a comforting fairy tale and turns into an unforgettable masterpiece. To understand why these clean victories are so rare, we have to look past the writers and look directly at ourselves. Why does a sane winning villain make us so profoundly uncomfortable? Psychologists have a term for this, called the just world hypothesis. But honestly, it's just our hardwired instinct to believe that life is fair. We desperately want to believe that good deeds are eventually rewarded, and that bad actions carry a cosmic receipt that must be paid in full. Storytelling has spent centuries acting as the ultimate delivery system for this bias. When real life feels chaotic, unfair, we turn to fiction to restore order. We watch movies and television to see the scales balance. So when a writer creates a brilliant villain, they are playing with fire. If they let the villain operate with perfect logic and win the game without a single mental flaw or external punishment, they aren't just giving us a dark ending, they're actively ripping away our psychological safety net. They're stripping away the comforting fiction that protects us from how random and unfair reality actually is. And this is why studio executives and focus groups almost always force writers to insert a catch. If a villain wins, they must be miserable. If they conquer a city, they must lose their mind. We need to see them suffering in a gold-plated cage because it allows the audience to sigh in relief and say, see, it wasn't worth it. Being bad makes you crazy. It's a coping mechanism designed to keep the audience from realizing a harsh truth. In a purely mechanical, logical world, a person with zero morals and a high level of competence has a massive advantage over someone burdened by empathy. When a story relies on a sudden mental collapse or a random twist to defeat a villain, it isn't executing a brilliant narrative payoff, it's throwing an intellectual tantrum. It's the writer stepping onto the board like a frustrated child and kicking over the pieces because they couldn't find a logical way for the hero to win. By inventing an uncharacteristic madness or a sudden basic error to ruin the antagonist, the story completely breaks its own internal rules, just to save the audience's feelings. It prioritizes comfort over truth. Ultimately, our obsession with forcing every brilliant villain to either lose their mind or lose the game says far more about our own anxieties than it does about the characters themselves. We use storytelling as a psychological coping mechanism, a narrative placebo designed to protect us from a deeply uncomfortable truth. We want desperately to believe that the universe has a natural balance, that evil is inherently a form of madness, and that a lack of moral compass will inevitably cause someone's plans to collapse. But by forcing every story into this predictable framework, we are fundamentally cheapening the art. We are trading genuine high-stakes drama for a participation trophy for the heroes. When a project like The Penguin, No Country for Old Men, or Zodiac has the sheer audacity to rip that safety net away, it does something revolutionary. It forces the audience to grow up. These endings work so profoundly because they refuse to grant us a clean exit. They don't let us close the streaming app with a comforting thought that the bad guy got what was coming to him, or that he's at least miserable in his success. Instead, we are left staring at a villain who's perfectly calm, deeply satisfied, and entirely unbothered by what they did. It is a harsh, icy bucket of water poured directly over our heads, stripping away the illusion of cosmic justice and replacing it with the reality of raw efficiency. Modern fiction wants to truly evolve. It needs to stop being terrified of the clean villain victory. We don't need fewer stories about monsters. We need stories that are brave enough to admit that sometimes the monster is the smartest person in the room. We need narratives that acknowledge that competence doesn't care about a right or a wrong, and that discipline paired with malice is a terrifyingly viable path to success. Because when the credits roll and the bad guy is still standing, completely lucid, completely victorious, and completely intact, the story ceases to be a forgettable fairy tale. It becomes a mirror to our own world, a haunting landmark in pop culture, and an ending that we will be talking about for decades.